Microsoft has invested $13 billion in OpenAI. Amazon poured billions into Anthropic. Google controls your search data. Meta has your social graph. The AI oligopoly is here. Today on CXOTalk number 899, Lord Tim Clement-Jones and Lord Chris Holmes, key leaders shaping UK AI policy in the House of Lords, reveal what business leaders must know now. I'm your host, Michael Krigsman. Let's get into it. Tim, tell us about your work in the House of Lords and your focus areas.
I speak for my party on all matters science, innovation and technology, and I chair a cross-party group on artificial intelligence as well, which I founded back in 2016-17. And one of the key issues for me is the power of big tech, which it really is increasingly, it's like going back in a sense to the big oil issues back in the 19th century, where you had vertical integration of an absolutely essential utility by a limited number of businesses. And that's what we're seeing increasingly. So already we had a lot of big tech concentration. We've got, control over two platforms, really Apple, Google. We've got cloud services really in the hands of, say, two, Microsoft and Amazon web services. We've got concentration. We've got Facebook, really, which is alongside TikTok, one of two really major social media outlets. So we're getting this concentration in digital, which is now being replicated in artificial intelligence, and especially with the links between OpenAI, for instance, and Microsoft, between Amazon and Anthropic, and of course Meta with its own large language model. So this kind of concentration is beginning to impact in a major way, which I think will have knock-on effects for society, for our democracy, for countries trying to develop their own AI models.
Chris, tell us about your work in the House of Lords and any initial thoughts that you have on this big tech set of issues.
I try and cover new technologies, including AI, blockchain, cyber, and all things digital assets and tokenization, with the threads of ESG and EDI running through all of those. Also cover financial services regulation and all things fintech. And really what I'm trying to bring out are the possibilities, the potential of all of these new technologies of themselves, and then looking at some of the really exciting value cases where you look at the technologies in combination for one another. But we only win with these technologies if we human lead on them. We only win if we focus on the public good, the common good, and see them as enablers, empowerers, and really in all our human hands. That's the opportunity. But as we all know about opportunities, they're never inevitabilities. It's down to us to make it so.
Tim just described this concentration of Microsoft and OpenAI, Amazon, Anthropic, Google Gemini, and DeepMind. You have Meta with Llama. What does this concentration mean for competition and for society?
It means concentration of information sources, effectively. I mean, one of the key things, this isn't just about, people accessing large language models, for the hell of it and for use in their daily life. And I entirely agree with Chris. The opportunities are there, but the risk is that what we're doing is we're getting our information from very limited sources. I mean, for instance, the impact on news media of the digital era has been considerable, with the monopoly of advertising that is now pretty much held by Google and Facebook. But of course, with the advent of artificial intelligence, which, in a sense, scrapes news data from the internet, that means that concentration and that impact on the news media is even higher. So this is becoming of great importance in terms of how people see the world. And if people grow up and they get all their information from one of the large language models, then they are directly influencing what we're doing and seeing. And I think that, just digressing slightly, but robotics is going to pronounce that even more when AI is embedded in robotics that we use for everyday life. So this is not a small thing.
There's no way that we can say that we win with these technologies if we just have a winner takes all reality. There's no question these companies, we all know the list of them you set out at the outset, Michael, they've come an extraordinarily long way in a relatively short space of time. Their business model is clear, their scaling has been clear, and that is one particular model, one particular approach. But we win with these technologies if we truly have a plurality, an understanding that AI isn't one technology. AI isn't just LLM, which I think the public narrative is tending towards that sense that we've been on an AI journey and we've now reached this point, and this is it. This is the zenith in many ways, the large language models. That's where we've been shooting towards. That's but one element of AI in a whole constellation of technologies. So I think each individual, each company, each community, each country needs to consider, what do they want their AI, what do they want their technology story, their technology narrative to be? How do they play to the elements, the values, the beliefs, the social, the democratic structures in that nation, and really thinking deeply into this. And that'll be the way that we succeed within this. It can't be that we just go down a route of winner takes all.
Chris is absolutely right. Increasingly, I think, and this is, if we're not careful, going to lead to a kind of nationalism as far as AI is concerned. There is this very strong mood, both in countries within the European Union, but also in the UK, that we need to be able to develop our own sovereign AI capabilities, and that if we're not careful, US companies are going to drown out our own ability to develop AI tools of every description. And so this, if we're not careful, this is going to be a backlash. And I want to avoid that, because I think we need to make sure that we take advantage of every kind of tool that is available internationally. But if we're dominated by 3 or 4 businesses, then I think that's going to create a reaction, which would be extremely unhelpful. And, we've seen what happens if you start applying sanctions and tariffs and so on. People get rather excited about that. And I don't believe that that is going to help develop our, if you like, technological partnerships across the world.
Folks, we have 2 tremendous guests today. Ask questions. If you are watching on LinkedIn, pop your question into the LinkedIn comments. If you're watching on Twitter, use the hashtag CXOTalk. And we have some questions that are coming in already relating to the international aspects and the economic aspects. And we're going to get to those questions momentarily. But I have a question for you both. You've both raised certain types of cautions. You've described the potential very significant impacts on society. But there's also another side to this, which is these companies are taking the risks that few organizations have the capability to take in order to make these investments in the LLMs and the data centers and infrastructure and so forth. And so, frankly, given that they're making the investment, what business is it of any of us to interfere? Let them do it. Let us all reap the benefits of AI.
History tells us that no industry sector, no market, no society or economy is at its best if there are no rules, if there are no regulations, if there isn't a sense of certainty, consistency, coherence, stability. Now, we're some way off that, I think, with these current approaches to AI. But everything tells me from that history that right-sized regulation would be extraordinarily beneficial, not just for citizens, but crucially for citizens, for consumers, for creatives. But also, it's abundantly clear that right-sized regulation is good for innovator, good for investor, because of that clarity, certainty, consistency, stability that comes from that. If you wanted a huge underscoring of that point, just look to English common law used around the world. Why? Why used in countries? Why used in agreements where people have no connection to the United Kingdom, have no intention of coming to the United Kingdom, but they still structure their agreements on English common law because of the stability that brings, because of the certainty, because of the reliability of that. So it clearly makes sense to have the right size regulatory framework around these systems. If we look at the particular model in the States, it's very clear that you can take that approach in an economy, in a market of that size, which is pretty much take as much economic resource as you can, take as much compute power as you can, take as much energy as you can, take as much data as you can on one side of the ledger, put that into the mix, and then see what the outcomes are. It's an approach. The results have certainly been more than interesting, but it's not the approach. There's a whole series of different approaches looking at what you may choose to do with that data before it even goes in to the algorithm. There's looking at how much of it's put in, what purpose are you getting at. So sure, it's one model, but the claim that it is exceptional, that it is like nothing that's come before in our societies, in our economies, in our democracy. So they need to be left alone, unshackled, unfettered.
I completely agree with Chris. And what we're seeing is incredible overdependence beginning to arise. I mean, you only have to look at Nvidia's market cap and some of the market cap of some of the other big players. I mean, 5 trillion is a bigger sum than the GDP of most countries apart from the US and China. So, we're talking extremely large entities here, and that dependence on those players, it risks a huge bust at the end of the day. People have been talking about a market bubble. The bankers are already getting pretty nervous. You talked about the investment, Michael, and of course that kind of vertical integration in terms of data centers, compute power, and so on is exactly what the big tech companies are doing, and they're deliberately designing it so the stack, if you like, the tech stack is something that isn't really very interoperable. Once you start developing your AI model, you're in their stack, and it's not that interoperable in terms of being able to ship to any other supplier. So that itself is monopolistic behavior, and will lead to just 2 or 3 major large language models being available to the public. So choice will be limited, and that will have a knock-on effect to governments. Already, the UK government really only buys from US vendors, the major tech companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and so on. UK developers don't get a look in. So this has major impacts on economies beyond the US and societies beyond the US.
And that concentration risk that Tim raises is absolutely critical. This be that the economic concentration risk, be it the technology concentration risk. And you only have to look at the AWS outage last week, which was just a minor glitch. These things happen. But look how that rippled right around the world because of that concentration in these small number of players. It's critical for businesses, for governments to really focus on that. And Tim rightly raises concentration risk, economic, technology. It's a very, if you're going to start somewhere, it's not a bad place to start when you're making your considerations around these issues.
We had a Microsoft glitch. So, I think that's a very good demonstration of that kind of overdependence.
We have a very interesting question from Anthony Scriffignano, our mutual friend, Tim. And he says, your point about big tech influencing how we see the world is spot on. Isn't part of how we win related to our ability to teach the workforce and the user base to ask critical questions about why they should believe what they're seeing from AI, which of course gets right to the heart of misinformation, AI automated misinformation and disinformation, and the fact that you have programs now like Sora that creates videos that are absolutely fake and look absolutely real.
Chris and I are both passionate about media digital literacy. And, without that, we are even more vulnerable. But if we have some media digital literacy, which really government and local government, central government, educators, a whole range of people need to get involved in, regulators as well, to make sure that we do develop those critical thinking skills in the face of digital media, in the face of AI tools, because, especially with hallucinations from AI models, we need to know whether we're being lied to effectively and whether or not the information we're getting is correct. We might open a major mainstream media newspaper, for instance, whether digitally or, in analog form. But that is going to be, we're pretty sure if we buy the right newspaper, it's going to be accurate. We're not sure about AI. So we need a different set of skills, and we need to actually discern misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes. You mentioned Sora, Michael. Absolutely. And so the risks build up. And in the face of that, we have to make sure we've got strategies for developing digital media literacy. And I'm sad to say that I don't think in the West, apart from one or two notable countries like Finland and Estonia, we're really getting it right yet.
Put the human at the heart of all this and to human lead on these technologies, which means imbuing these technologies with our human values and our principles: trust and transparency, inclusion and innovation, interoperability and international outlook, accountability, assurance, accessibility, all good to be in the mix. But there could never be a more critical time to have all of our critical senses and enabling young people through schooling and through lifelong education to have their critical faculties to the fore. And we've got a children's welfare and schools bill going through the House of Lords at the moment. I've got a number of amendments down there around these areas of having not only this understanding of how ed tech is working in the classroom, but to have hardwired through the curriculum, not just in compute subjects, not just in sciencey subjects, but hardwired through the whole curriculum, this sense of digital literacy, media literacy, AI literacy, data literacy, resilience, character education. These are what all of our young people need, because that is what will enable them to have their sword and their shield, and will be a key part of enabling them to succeed in this digital future now.
But how do you go about accomplishing that? Google has search data, Meta has social data, Microsoft has productivity data. How do you, Chris, go about injecting that human inclusive element into these companies that are relying on these enormous concentrated data sets? How do you do that?
First and foremost, because we have a great good fortune of still having the most splendid, stunning, of supercomputers, the most efficient, the most high-tech, if you will, human brain, which gives us all of the opportunities that we need if we deploy it individually and collectively as to what we want, how we want to bring in these frameworks into legislation, into regulation. And none of this means the heavy hammer of bans or controls in that sense. It means having the right sized regulatory approach, because everybody flourishes if you have that. And it means nothing short of just having those human values running through all this, because the truth of it is, I do believe this. I mean, maybe I have a touch of Panglossian naivety about myself, but I think you only, as an individual, as a company, as a society, you only succeed long term, firstly, together, and secondly, if you have those enduring human values wired in. These companies that we're discussing, on one level, they're doing extraordinarily well at the moment. But look at 1900 as to how many businesses were on the stock exchanges then to now. Look at 1950, look at 1970. That's not to say we should just wait and see. It means we should be very forward facing, enabling our education system. We've got a curriculum review which is due to report any time in the UK. That needs to have all of this wired through it all. But we can lead on this. And the worst thing we can do is to think it's all too big, it's all too complex. We retreat from the public sphere. We need to be even more present, even more connected, properly connected, humanly connected. And we truly then can be very cognizant of the risks and put in the right frameworks there, but really put everything in place to drive, to enable, to empower the upside. Because in no doubt, what we can do with these human-led technologies in our human hands, we haven't been able to do anything like that even a few years ago.
What we have to be very careful of is thinking of Gen Z and Gen Alpha and so on as being digital natives. I think it's actually quite interesting how cavalier young people can be about their own data. And, Chris is right. We need to have that in, all our institutions. One of the big issues we have is with another generation, our teachers. Upskilling them is an absolute priority in terms of understanding how they can then impart, if you like, digital safety messages and critical thinking messages to the young people that they teach. But Chris is right. You can't do without regulation. And, we're obviously experimenting with our online safety legislation. There's been huge pushback from the tech companies. We're age gating at 18. We're trying to make our internet safe for children in particular. But we are, facing some really big issues, because how do you capture all the harms that are occurring online? And new harms are occurring all the time. For instance, we don't think we captured the use of chatbots online enough in social media directed at children. There are things like live streaming, which we don't think are fully captured properly. There are, to be agile as a regulator is very, very difficult when you're interpreting legislation that may not have caught up with the new harms as they occur. And that is something that as legislators, Chris and I have to work with. We're slightly impatient of regulators, but sometimes the regulator isn't at fault. It's us as legislators. We didn't encompass what we really needed to encompass with the legislation, and we pay the price for that.
We have a bunch of questions that are coming in. Let's jump to some questions, but I just have to respond to one comment that Chris made. He referred to himself as Panglossian, as potentially having Panglossian naivete. And I was thinking, Chris, as you were talking, that you're really an optimist.
I'm a rational optimist. Yeah.
Okay. Let's jump to...
I'm a conditional optimist.
So we have a rational optimist and a conditional optimist.
Yeah, I'm an optimist as long as there's regulation down the track,
Well, what are you, Michael?
I am a realistic optimist. I'm not sure how that's any different from either of you, but or a skeptical optimist, because I've worked with so many tech companies over these last decades, and I understand the motivations and I understand the pressures and the goals and the power of these companies and the level of resources.
I mean, the watchword for me is diversity in so many ways. That I'm a great believer in a diverse society, because you get a range of ideas, you get a range of creativity. No, it isn't one size fits all. It isn't conformity. And if you find yourself focused on only 3 or 4 major businesses in any particular sector, you're getting a conformity. You're getting a lack of competition and a lack of diversity.
I once did an analysis of major software companies who were producing ERP products, and I did a word analysis, and it turned out that across all these major companies, the marketing, the messaging was virtually identical, because there's so much movement among the leaders of these companies.
That's been so interesting. You see Microsoft acquiring the ex-CEO of DeepMind, Google, and so on. And the shifting between those big tech companies is significant.
If you're watching, this would be an excellent time to subscribe to the CXOTalk newsletter. Join our community. We will notify you of upcoming shows just like this. Go to CXOTalk.com and sign up. Just take a second, do it right now. All right, we were on Twitter, and now let's take some questions from LinkedIn. And Jerry Kopich has been waiting patiently, and he asks this question. He says, how insulated is the UK if the global AI economic bubble bursts?
We're pretty vulnerable, actually, especially our UK government, because and Chris mentioned the AWS outage recently. We had a Microsoft outage as well. This is vulnerability on a big scale. If the whole of your government depends on 3 or 4 US suppliers, I mean, if Palantir went down for any particular reason, our government in defense and across our health service, could well be in trouble, because Palantir helps to organize all the data within those 2 services. So, we haven't mentioned them, but they are a significant player internationally in those 2 sectors, and in the UK as well. So, this is no small thing in terms of what could happen in the future. And cybersecurity, if we've seen vulnerabilities on a major scale from companies like Microsoft in the past. And so again, if you only have 1 or 2 major suppliers, whether it's platforms for operating systems or mobile platforms, you're again creating vulnerabilities for yourself. Once bad actors find a way in, then whole businesses are down. We recently had a major outage for our biggest car manufacturer, for Jaguar Land Rover, and they've been down for months and months. And the cost to the business is billions, a huge hole in their bottom line going forward. Now, luckily, they're owned by a major Indian company, and they can just about afford to go through it. But their suppliers, parts and so on in the supply chain, have been really badly affected and had to be propped up by loans and the UK government and so on. So, this is not some theoretical dependency. This is a huge issue.
Chris, we have a question from Arsalan Khan. Let me direct this to you, and I think it's quite related to this set of issues. Arsalan Khan says on Twitter, Companies are blaming AI for their massive layoffs. How can or should government even, how can or should government even step in this rapid change? What can government do that doesn't take 10 years?
It's a really key point because it takes us back to the human in all of this. And if the human must be at the heart of the technologies, and if the human must be leading on these technologies, then the human, in terms of quality, meaningful work, needs to be at the heart of all this. The key issue with all of this, I don't think is considered enough, is how you lead on the transition. I think that, as with other huge shifts in our time, that AI and other technologies will be job creating. And that's ultimately fine, but the transition, as it has been when other industries have started to wane and decline, you have to, as a government, you have to, as society, understand that transition and how you're going to manage through it and lead through it, because nobody is going to accept huge layoffs with no societal, no governmental level consideration on this. And we've seen it with other industries when they have started to disappear. That hasn't been fully understood. It hasn't been properly led on. There hasn't been the public debate, the discourse, the how do we all go through this together. We can't just have, for example, many businesses not taking graduates, newly qualifieds on, and that's already happening massively across all of those sectors. Well, how, as a young person, do you get your career underway? How do you get to be that sort of 4-5 years into your career if a lot of that entry level work and tasks is being taken over by AI? Well, there is absolutely a way through that, and that is focusing on the individual, our human aptitudes, our human skills. But it requires leadership. It requires a reimagination of how work is structured, how job roles are structured, understood, advertised for, and onboarded for. Because the reality is AI isn't, as such, wiping out jobs. It's doing things, it's doing particular tasks, it's doing particular parts of particular roles. Critically important to understand that. But that is the start point to then understanding how to structure, how to lead on the labour market for the future, where, as Tim mentioned a few minutes ago, the right way to do it is to focus on that diversity and that inclusion and to lead on that. And then we should be rationally positive, rationally optimistic as to how we can go about it.
We do have a paradigm for this, of course, in terms of how the horse gave way to the car. And I, often think about that photograph of Fifth Avenue in 1903, where there was one horseless carriage driving down Fifth Avenue, and all the rest were traps, pony traps, horse traps. And then 10 years later, in 1913, you didn't see a single horse and carriage going down Fifth Avenue in that famous photo. And what we don't know yet what jobs are going to be there in 10 years' time. And so we have to worry about this lack of entry-level jobs taking place. And we have to be absolutely intent on upskilling in the way that Chris described, and not just for the younger generation trying to get jobs at the moment. We have to be upskilling the older generation as well, because jobs are being substituted for, even in big tech. I mean, Microsoft is shedding thousands of jobs currently as we speak. And many of the other big tech companies are finding that they can do their coding through AI, not through using humans and so on. And so, they're noticing that. And other businesses, which may be even more be more analog, are still going to have to shed jobs in order to remain competitive. But it's because we don't absolutely know what new jobs are being created. We have to be very agile in all of this. And we'd been here before, and it wasn't a happy time.
What is the role of the government in this? Are you advocating that the government forces companies to undertake this reskilling? Is it government programs? What's the right construction?
I think so. They have to be more activist, and there are some good models out there. But, recently governments have adopted a kind of lifelong learning approach, but without really giving it enough teeth and a resource in order to do that. They've accepted the obligation without really giving the tools to those who are trying to deliver that lifelong skill set, if you like. So you can retrain if your job becomes, out of date in terms of the technology. You should be able to upskill with a grant or with a loan or whatever. Now, that is coming into place, but it's not nearly fast enough. And for young people, apprenticeships, particularly in some of the industries where it's freelance working is the norm. Again, there isn't enough apprenticeship going on, and the kinds of taxation that we have, it doesn't help with that. So, we haven't yet got our skills right, but it is something that government should be doing and also obliging larger companies to undertake.
In schools, have it threaded right through the curriculum and indeed further in higher education. And then when we get into your career and the workplace itself, bite-sized badges, boot camps, all of those elements where you can, at speed, in an agile manner, get these skills, get these competencies while you're in role. So you have speed, you have pace, you have agility as you're moving through your career. It's doable, but ultimately, as so much, it comes down to leadership, and that leadership should come very much from the top.
When you say come from the top, you're referring from the companies or from the government?
It should come right from the Prime Minister and then every level down. And then in companies, in all businesses, in all organizations, there's a leadership role for everybody to take at their level of the organization to lead on this.
So from your perspective, this is I don't want to put words in your mouth, it seems a major fundamental society mandate, if we put it that way.
Last year, 2 billion of us went to the polls in democracies around the world. And yet, where was any of this talk in those manifestos, in those party election broadcasts, in that election literature? Where was anything talking about what could AI, what could blockchain mean for you, your families, your businesses, your communities, your cities, your country? And yet, if we look at the major challenges of our time, climate crisis, energy emergency, migration, cost of living, we're all unbelievably connected, and yet there's a loneliness epidemic. Well, technologies have a lot to say for all of those issues if they are human-led technologies in our human hands. What phenomenal manifestos parties could have written, talking to all of those issues of our time, so many global in nature, so many existential in nature, and yet human-led narrative, human-led technologies enabling that narrative. That could have been so positive to draw people into the public discussion, the public discourse around how we go about these new technologies. And yet, frankly, to find much mention in any of those, you'd have needed to find my great-great-great-grandfather, Sherlock Holmes, to try and be deployed, to try and find much mention of it.
I mean, people think of the first duty of governments being security, if you like, but livelihoods are part of that security, in my view. And, pathways to jobs, education, and so on must be a vital role for government. I don't think that governments can just simply delegate that to business.
This is a question from Brian Mosley, and he says, how do we protect ourselves from the impending weapons of mass persuasion? And he says by Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, but let's just make this weapons of mass persuasion, meaning AI generated misinformation and disinformation.
we're back to critical thinking. And also, I think how data is directed to you in a targeted kind of a way. We all have to be increasingly careful about the use of our data, the kind of surveillance capitalism that Shoshana Zuboff talked about, where, basically you're giving your data to social media, and then social media is targeting you with advertising and so on. Well, increasingly that's going to happen in terms of misinformation, disinformation, and already is, quite frankly. For instance, messages during election campaigns and so on, and how much regulation is there of those kinds of messages in most of our democracies. So we're already, in a real problem. And we have to, again, we can't just rely on regulation. We have to rely on our own critical faculties.
Critical thinking, critical senses to the fore. Test, verify, take that second, that third, that fourth click, and always be so present and so alert, because the government have a key role to play, but we have to be absolutely tooled up ourselves as citizens, our swords and our shields to the fore.
Here's a question from Dr. Carolina Sanchez Hernandez, who says, what do we do when no one is able to explain the outputs of AI when a person is unable to get a loan or insurance, because these are black box systems very often, the algorithms? Tim, you wrote a whole book about this. The big challenge is oversight going forward, and also oversight of the entire AI value chain. So what do we do about this black box element that's making key decisions over our lives?
Chris and I are passionate about a regulation that makes sure that you do get that element of transparency, and you do get redress if decisions are made by this black box and you're not informed about it, or it's biased. There isn't a human in the loop, and so on. And, there's no escaping it. If we're going not to be completely subject to AI decisions, whether by government or private businesses like insurance or bankers or whatever it may be, we need to have that level of regulation. You can't just rely on voluntary agreements. And, we talked about being tech optimists or tech realists or whatever. Well, I'm an optimist, but it's conditional on making sure that we have this kind of regulation in place, because otherwise all we're doing is making sure that people are living in a world which is completely opaque, where decisions are made about them they've got no control over and no opportunity of redress. So that's not a world I want to see. It's where literally, the machine, AI, is our master, not our servant, to quote the title of my book.
Great advert there for Tim's book, and I recommend it to everybody. And he hasn't even offered me a percentage for that endorsement of it, but it is a good read. So if you haven't, do get your hands on it. And similarly, I wrote a report on this subject earlier this year, and I entitled it 8 Realities, 8 Billion Reasons to Regulate. And I just set out exactly what this question gets to. The person who doesn't get a loan and doesn't even know that AI was in the mix, never mind that AI was the rejecter of their loan application. I looked at the scammed, I looked at the teacher, I looked at the transplant patients, people on the liver transplant list in this country. AI is involved there. Do they even know that's the case? So first things first, know that AI is there. So labeling, transparency, because without those two things, how can you possibly have anything which looks like trust? Secondly, do not for 1 minute accept this argument that it's a black box, it's just too complicated, we can't know what's going on there. Because when the organizations need to know, you'll find out that it is possible to know what's going on, and you can make those changes. So the legislation I brought in draft in 2023 was to many of these points to look at the right regulatory framework for these technologies, which we call AI. And I think as a formulation, if we are principles-based, outcomes-focused, and inputs understood. That really puts us the right framework to go about this. And as you see that outcomes focused, inputs understood, you can see by doing that, you really squeeze that supposed black box in the middle.
Let's jump to another question. This is from Hui Wang on LinkedIn. And she says, and she's a senior data scientist. So this is from that perspective. And she says, what prevents innovators from being reduced to data tenants only in the big tech's empire?
I'm passionate about the open source movement myself. And I think a way of escaping from just being, if you like, the slaves of the big language models in that sense is if there are open source models which you can piggyback on and create new forms of AI tools using that. Those bigger models. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the Llama large language model from Meta, but it is open source and it is available by and large for people to experiment with, build their own models, and so on. That is not true of Claude or ChatGPT in quite the same sort of way. So, there are the possibilities of being able to use the power of models that have been created, and that will then create a diversity of AI tools that would be available. And I think that's really what we look to in the UK. I don't think we're going to have the kind of compute capacity, the sheer sophistication of chips and so on, which and indeed even the financial resources to create our own large language models in quite the same way. So we're going to want to piggyback on some of those. And I think that's the answer. The data sets that we'd be using would be not quite as comprehensive and scraped from every bit of the internet in the way that they are in the Claude and ChatGPT. They would be more proprietary, and probably hopefully people will have paid for the rights to access the data, so that then there'd be benefit for those who created those data sets. So again, I think that would be beneficial in many other ways as well, rather than the current situation where people like OpenAI and Anthropic pretty much are denying that they need to pay anybody for training their large language models on what is often copyright data.
I think open source has the potential, it's not inevitable, but open source has the potential to be the special source in this. And building on that, to understand that the approach and the models that are built and deployed out of the valley, that's a particular approach, but it's one approach. There is a whole array of different ways of going about this, a whole array of innovative ways of going about this. If we consider where certain data rests, if we consider some of the data sets that we have in this country, if we really understand all of the issues around privacy, if we understand all the issues around whose data it is, who owns it, who has the rights to that data, if we start to talk much more about the potential for the National Data Library, the NDL, and what could come about there, many, many reasons to be rationally positive about this, but we will get this fundamentally wrong in the UK if we believe that the US model is the only model, or we seek to just simply copy or ape that model, because we will just be Coke light if we do that.
And we've got a debate raging in the UK, and I know that there are many cases in the US, Michael, where copyright owners are suing, the big tech companies for infringement by training them, training their models on copyright material. And all those cases are yet to come through, to see what the final decision is. But certainly our government has had a lot of criticism for trying to give a free pass to big tech companies in their training, and it's going to continue to be extremely controversial even when we come to new legislation next year, because we're due to have an AI bill come through next year.
And of course, speaking for everybody in the US, we here in the US do believe that our way, I'm not going to say it's the only way, but it's the right way for everybody else. Okay, moving on.
Yes. I mean, but of course, the approach to data is very different in the States. And what we're thinking of more is how individuals can, in a sense, collect the data with their within communities, if you like, but for public benefit. But it does mean that they will have greater control over their own the data that they're creating in their daily lives. So it is a different approach.
AI infrastructure is becoming as necessary as electricity. Given this, should data centers be treated as regulated monopolies?
I think there's a question which is worth debating around a number of elements of these technologies as to what's the role of the state, what's the role of the business. A word Tim used a long while ago is absolutely right. This sense of getting the right partnerships will get us to the right place.
I think they will be regarded as a utility ultimately, like gas or electricity or whatever, because they're such an important part of the infrastructure, quite honestly.
And also, the cost of developing these data centers is becoming so astronomically expensive.
Yes, the environmental cost included.
Yes, and there's also the impact on electricity prices. I mean, here in the US, our electricity prices have significantly increased over the last year or two.
You don't know anything compared to the UK, Michael, seriously.
And it's all jammed tomorrow. We're told that small nuclear reactors are going to be the solution, but they won't come on stream for, a decade or so. This is a bit pie in the sky at the moment.
Chris, I'll have to mention what you said about what's going on in the UK to my wife, who recently complained to me that our electricity bill had doubled.
Well, honestly, you are still very much tucking into the nice pot of jam compared to the UK situation, I promise you.
I think you better come on holiday here and just see what it costs in your holiday cottage, Michael.
How do we strike the right balance between regulation for the protection of society versus protecting new technologies?
What we have to do is understand that this kind of mantra that regulation is the enemy of innovation is not the way forward. And what we have to do is understand that proper forms of regulation involve assessing the risk, making sure that the standards you're imposing create an interoperability with other countries. We're not sitting there in isolation, so you're not creating a kind of oasis for your own developers who can't then get out and sell their wares and sell their products overseas. You've got to make sure that you're regulating in an appropriate fashion. And I would say that you've got to have the risk assessment. If you've got high risk AI being created, you've got to make sure that has certain duties of transparency, accountability, liability, and so on. And that the consumer, if it's consumer facing, has the right of redress. If it's business, they have other rights relative to that. This is not some terrible idea. We regulate so many areas. Aviation, the motor car wouldn't have taken off unless we'd had safety regulation for the car. Consumer products, most of them have safety regulation, and that's what we need for AI.
OpenAI has lost billions. It survives only because of investment from companies like Microsoft. Anthropic survives because of investment from Amazon. Can we make the argument that market concentration is a great thing because it's enabling AI?
You could make the argument that it's a great thing until it isn't. It's something that a lot of us should be at least somewhat concerned about, that economic concentration and the circularity of funding, and applying all the principles that we know. So looking as to what you're investing in, what is the return on investment. Applying all of those good economic and business principles that are well made will give us the right answers and the right analysis.
And of course, is this going to be one great bubble at the end of the day? I think we're all a little bit apprehensive about this.
Chris brought up this issue of which we have not touched on, which is the circularity of funding. Just your views on that. It's such an important issue, and but we're out of time.
Yes, absolutely. And this is exactly why people are worried about this bubble, because, Microsoft is investing in OpenAI. OpenAI is buying credits from Microsoft, and Nvidia is doing pretty much the same. And so they're feeding each other economically. And if confidence goes, and if OpenAI doesn't make any money and isn't making a great deal of money at the moment, then what happens? Everything goes bust. And it all depends on Microsoft continuing with its mainstream business rather than with the large language model ChatGPT.
What should business leaders and boards of directors do in this complex environment with shifting regulations, changing technologies? Your advice, please, for business leaders and boards.
Get involved, get upskilled, get knowledgeable, get involved in the debate, the discussion, understand what you're trying to achieve as a business, understand how potentially these technologies could help, and partner up and really connect and make it a team effort.
Know what your values are in the middle of all of this, because there's nothing like AI for making you question your values in all of this.
Know what your values are. That's an abstract concept, potentially.
It is potentially abstract, but frankly, what is the purpose of your business? How do you treat your employees? What kind of trust do your consumers, do your employees and your other stakeholders have in you? Well, often that's all about the values that you as a business have. And I think we forget about them too often.
Chris, what advice do you have for regulators and policymakers when it comes to this set of AI issues?
Understand what your role is, understand how these technologies are developing and how they're already being deployed, and look about an approach where you do right-sized regulation and you understand the complexity of the needs of the consumer, the creative, the citizen, the investor, the innovator. It's not straightforward, but it's completely doable. And we've seen examples in other areas in the UK where we've done it. So we know how to do this. We need to do it. And in the words of a great American company, their best ad campaign ever, Nike, ultimately, having done all that, just do it.
Tim, you're going to get the last word. Advice for regulators and policymakers.
Resist the blandishments of big tech, who will tell you that all regulation is terrible. They won't be able to innovate and do business. But you have to resist that. We know the resources that are going into this from big tech, both in Brussels, London, Washington, and so on. And we need to be resistant to that.
How do you resist? They have so much money and resources to throw around and share. How do you resist?
You resist by coming on CXOTalk and influencing the influencers, Michael.
That works for me. And with that, a huge thank you to Lord Tim Clement-Jones and to Lord Chris Holmes. I am so grateful to you both. Thank you for taking your time and sharing your expertise with us once again.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure as always.
And I hope you'll both come back. Everybody, thank you for watching. Now, before you go, subscribe to the CXOTalk newsletter. Go to CXOTalk.com. We have amazing shows coming up. Check it out. We'll see you again next time, We'll see you again next time, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll have fun with AI.